You've bought a new camera lens and you find that the autofocus isn't very fast? Do you miss out on a lot of photos because you don't have time to focus properly? Well, in this video, I'm going to show you 5 tips that will help you put an end to the autofocus that keeps hunting endlessly and struggles to quickly focus on the subject. So we will not delve into very technical details, but instead just touch on some basic concepts of how autofocus works on our modern equipment so that you can understand the remainder of this video tutorial. In order to achieve focus, the autofocus feature will need to calculate the precise distance to the subject by utilizing sensors that analyze the scene being photographed in real time and make adjustments accordingly. On all lenses, the autofocus will have the ability to determine this exact point by covering the range that extends from the minimum focusing distance all the way to infinity. The minimum focusing distance is the distance below which your lens will no longer be able to focus, which means that if your subject is located closer than this distance, you will never be able to focus on it and will need to move back. This minimum distance is specific to each lens and will therefore vary depending on the one you are using. For example, on my Sigma 150mm macro lens, it is 0.38 min, while on my 150-600 lens it is 2.8 min. Contrary to popular belief, all lenses can focus to infinity, meaning they have no distance limits, so you can focus on objects very far away without any issues or constraints. So the speed of autofocus is its ability to move through and analyze these different distances more or less quickly until it finds the exact one where your subject is located and locks the focus on it to make it perfectly sharp. Unfortunately, not all lenses are equal in terms of speed, and some will be able to cover these distances much more quickly than others. So you most likely suspect it, but high-quality lenses enable for much faster focusing than low-quality lenses, achieving nearly instantaneous focus for the most technologically advanced ones. But fortunately for your wallet, there are several tips to make the autofocus of your current lens much faster without breaking the bank, and that's exactly what we're going to see right now. So on most telephoto lenses designed for wildlife photography, it is now possible to specify certain distance ranges that the lens can or cannot use, thanks to an adjustment button located directly on the lens barrel known as the focus range limiter. For example, on my Sigma 150-600mm lens, I have 3 different ranges, one from 2.8 to 10 meters, one from 10 meters to infinity, and one from 2.8 meters to infinity. By setting limitations on this focusing range, I will be able to exclude a whole part, thereby instructing the autofocus not to waste time trying to focus at unnecessary distances, which, in certain situations, can greatly enhance its speed and optimize its performance. For example, if my subject is very close to me, I know that it is unnecessary to use all the ranges because by setting my lens to the distance ranging from 2.8 to 10 meno, the autofocus will be much faster at calculating the focus since it won't waste time analyzing what is very far away. So, be careful because this requires a good understanding of distances, and if you make a mistake, you won't be able to focus properly and you might end up wasting even more time readjusting. For example, if I use the range from 2.8 to 10 meters because I estimated that my subject is approximately 9 meters away from me, when in fact it was at 11 meters, then no matter what I do, the autofocus will never be able to focus properly and I will inevitably miss all my photos because they will be completely blurry. Another tip to gain valuable tenths of a second is to utilize the indicator screen positioned above your lens and manually rotate the focus ring to preset it to a distance that is in close proximity to where you estimate your subject is located. To explain this technique, let's imagine, for example, that I'm walking in nature and I spot a deer that I estimate to be about 15 meters away from me. So I first limit my range from 10 meters to infinity to prevent the autofocus from wasting time on short distances as we saw in the previous tip. But I can go even further to optimize it by manually placing the focus indicator around this distance, for example between 10 and 15 meters. This way I will be able to further increase the autofocus calculation speed compared to if the indicator was placed at 40 meters for instance. So this concept is fairly simple, yet in numerous situations the focus is predetermined to an unnecessarily far distance. This is the case, for example, when using the lens to observe something that one would have seen in the distance in the absence of binoculars. focus. And in these kinds of cases, we often forget to reset the focus to a more typical distance, so it mistakenly remains at infinity, which will then cause us to lose precious tenths of seconds unnecessarily when we encounter an animal that is actually quite close to us. So, this obviously requires some experience and above all, an ability to react very quickly, but this technique also helps to further speed up the autofocus, so don't hesitate to try it out. Optical stabilization is a mechanism found in most telephoto lenses used for wildlife photography that can partially compensate for the movements of the photographer when shooting handheld, thereby reducing the occurrence of motion blur in photos to some extent. This mechanism is indeed very effective, but its use requires additional computing resources from your hardware that, in some situations, are not necessary at all and can even unnecessarily slow down the autofocus. Because stabilization is especially useful when you are shooting with very slow shutter speeds handheld, but it will have absolutely no impact as soon as you start using fast speeds. Therefore, I recommend that when lighting conditions allow, you deactivate this stabilization, which will free up some computing memory for your equipment and thus make the autofocus a little faster. For the same reasons, if you're shooting on a tripod, I also recommend disabling this optical stabilization since it'll be unnecessary in most cases. The focus points are the visual representation of the sensors that will be utilized by the camera in order to focus on the subject being captured. These are the small black or red rectangles that you can observe when looking through the viewfinder and that you have the ability to modify by moving the camera's joystick. The principle is simple. Place your subject on one of these rectangles and the camera will focus at that point. Changing the focus point will make the camera focus on a different area. Unfortunately, not all focus points are equal in terms of performance, and some can seriously slow down the focusing speed. This is particularly the case with the focus points located on the sides, which will struggle to focus properly in certain situations because they are much less efficient and sensitive than the points located towards the center. If you're having trouble focusing and notice that the autofocus is struggling endlessly, don't hesitate to prioritize the central focus points as they are the most effective, allowing you to gain speed even if you have to crop the image later in post-processing for better composition. And finally, to focus, the autofocus needs to have very visible anchor points at its disposal, such as well-defined edges, and the more contrasted the area you aim at with the focus points, the easier and faster the focusing will be. So I'm sure you've already found yourself in a situation where the autofocus keeps hunting endlessly for no apparent reason. Well, here's the solution to this problem. Let's consider a battery as an example to explain this principle. It's commonly stated that the focus should be on the subject's eye, and I frequently emphasize this to you because it's accurate. It's the part of the photograph that should be the sharpest in the image. Unfortunately, in the case of the magpie, the lens will often struggle to focus if aiming at the eye because the feathers around it are also completely black. So we have a very significant lack of contrast, and in this kind of situation the autofocus will generally struggle endlessly because it won't be able to lock onto the subject's eye. The solution to fix this issue is to instead focus on another part of the bird that is much more contrasted. For example, if I focus on the shoulder of the magpie at the intersection of the black feathers and the white feathers, then the autofocus will immediately succeed in focusing because it's a highly contrasted area that is much easier for it to analyze. So be very careful with this technique, as you will need to find an area that is almost on the same plane as the subject's eye, otherwise it may fall outside the depth of field if it's too small, and unfortunately this may not always be possible depending on the subject you are photographing. So, to increase the chances of also having the eye sharply in focus, if you use this technique, consider slightly closing the aperture of the diaphragm, which will result in increasing the depth of field. Here are these 5 tips that will help you make the autofocus of your lens much faster, even if it's not a high-end model. Don't hesitate to really test them to get a good grasp of them, and especially understand in detail how they work. And if you know of others, feel free to share them in the comments of this video. If you enjoyed this episode and it helped you learn new things, consider sharing it with your friends on social media so they can benefit from it as well. This is the best way to support my work and especially help the channel grow. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the upcoming videos. I publish publish an average of 1 episode per week dedicated to wildlife and nature photography. If you would like to quickly improve in photography and especially bring much more creativity to your images, you can also download my free PDF guides that have just appeared on the screen. To access the download page, simply click on the small thumbnail located on the right side and you will be automatically redirected. That is all for this video. Thank you very much for watching until the end, and I will see you soon for a new episode. Goodbye.